earned property like her. Personal parking lot. Cheryl ignored warnings, manipulated HOA rules, and even broke into his converted garage office twice. So Roy did the unthinkable. Today, you'll hear how one homeowner turned the tables with a revenge so bold, it got Cheryl kicked out of the neighborhood. Was he justified? Let's dive in. I'm Roy, a software developer who mostly works from home. If you're wondering what that's like, picture hours of coding, debugging, and Zoom calls in a peaceful, dedicated workspace. I'm not antisocial, I simply value quiet. When I focus, I want as few distractions as possible. Years ago, I bought what I thought was the perfect place, a suburban house in a neat, HOA-governed neighborhood. You've probably heard the jokes or even horror stories about HOAs. Sometimes they're small stuff like punishing you for having the wrong shade of curtains. Other times they can be downright tyrannical. But at first glance, this neighborhood seemed pleasant. Well-maintained lawns, tree-lined streets, friendly folks walking their dogs or waving as they watered plants. It was normal, peaceful, the perfect environment for me to settle into. Even better, my property had a detached garage which I turned into my dream office. I poured heart and soul into that conversion. The correct permits, insulation, wiring, high-speed internet, a mini fridge, and every finishing touch you can imagine. Some folks questioned why I'd sacrifice a space for my car, but we live in an area with mild weather, snow is rare, and my driveway plus a small carport seemed sufficient. I wanted a quiet sanctuary for my work, a place I could escape to for creative tasks. I was excited and thought I'd found a slice of heaven. For a while, that's exactly what I got. I minded my own business, waved politely to neighbors, and stuck to HOA guidelines so nobody would have cause to complain. The people on my left were always nice, and the folks down the street seemed equally laid back. Then came Cheryl. She moved in next door with a level of fanfare that felt more like a small festival. Large moving trucks blocking the street, furniture strewn about, and what seemed like endless boxes. I didn't think much of it, other than maybe she had a big household. But the very day she arrived, she knocked on my door and asked me to move my car. Why? Because she felt it was not aligned properly in the driveway, which might make it harder for the moving truck to maneuver. That was my first brush with how particular she could be. In the weeks that followed, I noticed she wasn't just a new neighbor but also a new HOA board member. Usually, fresh arrivals take a while before getting involved, but Cheryl wasted no time. She campaigned for a spot on the board almost immediately. Soon enough, I heard rumors she walked around the neighborhood at dawn, jotting down anything that might be considered a violation. A hedge that needed trimming, a car that wasn't washed often enough, a recycling bin left out too long. At first, I dismissed these stories as gossip. Then I got my first official complaint in the mail. Apparently, my succulent garden violated the approved vegetation list. My jaw dropped. Succulents. Low-maintenance, drought-tolerant plants. Hardly some wild jungle. I'd even seen neighbors with similar setups. But the notice was real, so I wrote a polite email back, citing examples of others who had succulents. Before I could process that, a second complaint arrived. I'd left my garbage bin on the curb a few hours longer than allowed. Mind you, our collection day is early, and I sometimes get stuck in back-to-back calls. But that was enough for Cheryl to file a formal warning. She then posted a message on the HOA forum, implying that certain residents, obviously me, though not named directly, were ignoring neighborhood standards. That's when it dawned on me that she might be targeting me specifically. Why, I couldn't guess. Unless it was just her power trip. I tried to let it slide. In an HOA environment, you often get folks who feel important by policing small details. I told myself I'd do my best to comply, keep my head down, and not engage. But Cheryl wasn't simply overly enthusiastic about rules. She was beginning to zero in on me, and I'd soon discover how far she'd go. It all escalated when I found Cheryl's car under my carport one stormy afternoon. I'd been in a crucial Zoom meeting, discussing a software rollout with clients. Thunder rumbled, lightning flashed, and at some point I vaguely heard a car horn. When the meeting ended, I walked outside to find Cheryl leaning against her SUV parked under my covered carport, presumably to keep it from the rain. She waved me over like I should be thrilled to see her there. "Is everything okay?" I asked, as calmly as I could. She shrugged. "The street's flooding. Figured your carport was better than nothing." I tried to remain polite. "I see, but this is private property. You really should have asked." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't own the rain," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Emergency situations are covered by HOA rules, so park sharing should be allowed." I was speechless. First, I'd never seen any rule about forcibly sharing someone's private parking to escape a few puddles. Second, her tone was downright rude, as though I was at fault for objecting. She told me we could discuss it at the next HOA meeting, hopped into her SUV and drove off, leaving me there in disbelief. Not long after, a proposal circulated among the HOA members, something about requiring homeowners to share parking during inclement weather and emergency conditions, public safety, flood avoidance, the works. If you've ever seen a rule written to sound noble but actually serve one person's convenience, this was it. I emailed the board, pointing out the potential for abuse. Did inclement weather mean heavy storms? Light drizzle? A mild threat of hail? Where did it end? But Cheryl had apparently convinced enough people that this was merely about being good neighbors. The rule passed. That's when I felt my first real pang of dread. If Cheryl could twist the bylaws so easily, what else was she capable of? Sure enough, about 2 weeks later, I had to run errands. Instead of returning for my usual lunch break, I stayed at a coffee shop to work remotely. I was gone for a good chunk of the day. When I finally got back, I noticed the side door to my converted garage, my beloved office, was slightly open. My stomach dropped. I'm meticulous about locking up, so what was going on? Cautiously, I walked over, opened the door, and nearly had a heart attack. Cheryl's SUV was inside my garage, right next to my desk and computers. Ask yourself, how would you react? Would you call the police immediately, or race to confront her with furious words? I stood there, stunned, then noticed a small handwritten note taped to my office chair. It read, "Needed a place to park. The old code still worked, hope you don't mind." The gall, the entitlement, my mind was racing. I'd once given Cheryl that keypad code for a one-time reason. She claimed she wanted to see how I'd installed insulation for her own project. I thought I'd changed it, but apparently, I'd failed to confirm the change. Now she'd use that oversight to treat my office as her personal garage. There was no apology or sense of wrongdoing in that note. Just an exclamation point, as if this was normal. Anger blazed inside me. Who does that? I muttered. This wasn't like borrowing sugar from a neighbor. She'd broken into my private workspace. My hands shook as I immediately updated the code and tested it. Then I waited, too unsettled to move her car myself. An hour later, Cheryl strolled over with a bright, casual smile, like she'd done nothing unusual. "Hey, Roy, I saw you change the code. Something wrong?" she asked, feigning innocence. I struggled to keep my composure. "Yes, something's wrong. I came home to find your SUV parked in my private office. You used the old code without permission. This is trespassing." She rolled her eyes, insisting, "No harm done, right? The weather was bad and I knew you'd understand." That's when I put my foot down and warned her, "If you ever do this again, I'll pursue legal action." She seemed amused by the word trespassing, as though it was an overreaction. "Fine," she snapped. "Didn't realize you'd get so bent out of shape. Whatever." Then she drove off, leaving me angrier than I'd ever been in my life. For days I tried to focus on work, telling myself it was over, but Cheryl's sense of entitlement was about to reach a whole new level. Not even a week later, I returned from some errands to find that side door open again. My heart hammered as I flipped on the lights. There it was, Cheryl's SUV, once more inside my garage. No note, no explanation. It was as if she'd decided my private workspace belonged to her whenever she pleased. My head spun with rage, frustration, and an underlying fear that she might escalate further if I confronted her directly. I needed a strategy that would finally show her she couldn't do this. Would you confront her? Call the cops right then? Roy had a more extreme idea. A story he'd heard about towing an illegally parked vehicle popped into his mind. He imagined how Cheryl might react if she believed her car was not only towed but sold for scrap. It sounded over the top, but then again, so was Cheryl's behavior. I called a friend who runs a small towing and storage service. He owed me a favor from years back, so he agreed to help me quietly. We timed it so nobody would see. Within an hour, a tow truck rolled up and carefully loaded Cheryl's SUV, hauling it to a secure lot miles away, a place where repossessed or scrapped vehicles often end up. I paid out of pocket, but at that point, it felt worth every dime. I wanted Cheryl to experience genuine consequences for ignoring my boundaries. Then I waited. I sat at my computer, half working, half watching for signs of Cheryl. Sure enough, early that evening there was furious banging on my front door. I opened it to find her in a state of panic and rage. "Where is my car?" she practically screeched. "Did you move it again? I can't find it anywhere." I feigned a concerned frown. "Oh, you're talking about that SUV you left in my garage without permission again?" "Yeah. I assumed you didn't want it. Looked abandoned, so I sold it for scrap." Her eyes went wide with shock, then narrowed with fury. "You can't do that. That's theft. I'm calling the police," she shouted, waving her phone as if it were a lethal weapon. I remained eerily calm, explaining that if the police arrived, I'd be more than happy to show them all the security footage of her repeated trespassing, plus the complaint letters establishing her pattern of harassment. I used that word, harassment, because at this point, it certainly felt that way. She turned beet red, spat out some curses, and stormed off. Not an hour later, there was another knock. This time it was Cheryl's husband, a tall, broad-shouldered man I'd only seen in passing. He wasted no time trying to intimidate me. "You've messed with the wrong family. Where's my wife's car?" he snarled, fists clenched. I refused to back down, telling him it was no longer on my property. If he wanted to escalate, we could do it legally. He yelled about grand theft auto and how I'd pay for this, but I stared him down, pointing out that his wife had trespassed multiple times. Did he want to go to court over it? He hesitated, seeming torn between anger and the realization that Cheryl was in the wrong. After a tense moment, he left, slamming the door behind him. No police arrived, no immediate repercussions. I was on pins and needles for days, expecting legal threats or officers to show up at my doorstep. Instead, I got an email about an emergency HOA meeting. The subject line, "Important property dispute, attendance strongly advised." But what Cheryl did next crossed every line at that meeting. She painted me as a vicious, vindictive neighbor who had stolen her SUV. She demanded immediate action against me, presumably hoping her influence on the HOA board would secure a swift punishment. My initial reaction was to wonder if I should skip the meeting. My stress levels were already sky high. But I knew I had to present my side or risk letting her spin the narrative unchallenged. I arrived at the meeting early, accompanied by a calm, level-headed lawyer friend who agreed to back me up if legal threats were tossed around. The room buzzed with tension. Cheryl sat on one side, flanked by a few supporters who were either loyal to her or frightened of crossing her. The board president opened the floor for discussion, and Cheryl wasted no time launching into a tirade. She claimed I'd maliciously seized her vehicle to teach her a lesson, causing her emotional distress, and demanded severe penalties or even my removal from the community. She pounded the table, voice quivering with anger. Then it was my turn. I stepped up, heart pounding. In my hand were security camera stills showing Cheryl's SUV inside my garage. Twice. The timestamps were clear. The first moment I displayed these images, a hush fell over the room. I calmly explained how I'd found her car each time, how I'd given her repeated warnings, and how she blatantly disregarded them. I even had copies of complaint letters she'd sent me over trivial matters, succulents, trash bins, to illustrate her pattern of harassing me. Finally, I admitted that I'd told her I sold her car for scrap, but in reality, I'd simply had it towed and stored. It wasn't actual theft, though I intended to teach her a lesson about what it felt like to have your property removed without consent. Some people in the room gasped. Others nodded, clearly seeing the parallel I was drawing. If she repeatedly stole my private space, maybe she needed a taste of that same helplessness. Cheryl glared at me, possibly feeling victorious that I'd admitted I hadn't sold the car. But that small triumph evaporated when the board members, and the rest of the neighbors, began to see the bigger picture. One neighbor stood up and recounted how Cheryl had threatened them with fines if they didn't keep their garden hose perfectly coiled. Another mentioned how she'd demanded they cut their hedges to a specific height to avoid detracting from neighborhood aesthetics. Someone else said she had threatened that her friend on the board could make life very difficult if they dared to argue with her. As these testimonials piled up, Cheryl's face grew pale. The board president, who had seemed neutral at first, now turned to her with evident disappointment. "This is not the spirit of our HOA," he said. "We're here to maintain and protect the neighborhood, not wage personal vendettas." An emergency vote was called to remove Cheryl from the board, and it passed by a landslide. She tried to claim I'd orchestrated a smear campaign, but the evidence of her repeated trespassing and intimidation was too solid. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me. Some congratulated me for standing up to her. Others expressed concern, saying I'd taken a huge risk by towing her car and pretending I'd sold it. I admitted it was a gamble, but politeness and direct requests had failed. Sometimes you have to do something drastic to get through to someone who respects no boundary. They nodded, understanding, but also relieved they hadn't been the ones forced to face her head-on. In the aftermath, Neighbors felt emboldened to share more stories about Cheryl's tyranny. It was like a floodgate had opened. The new HOA influence vowed to review policies more carefully, drafting clearer guidelines so nobody could manipulate them for personal gain. They specifically addressed what should happen in true emergencies, severe floods, hurricanes, etc., ensuring cooperation would be handled through official channels, not random trespassing. Cheryl, meanwhile, faded into the background. She stopped sending complaint letters, stopped prowling the neighborhood at odd hours. I spotted her husband a few times, but he mostly kept his head down. A rumor sprang up that she was putting the house on the market, and sure enough, a for sale sign appeared. Within weeks, the place was empty. On moving day, I saw Cheryl from my garage office window. She glanced my way, caught my eye, then looked down, as if ashamed or defeated. She climbed into her car and left, no words exchanged, no dramatic farewell. Life improved drastically once she was gone. The HOA scheduled a potluck to foster a more positive atmosphere, and I actually showed up, wanting to demonstrate that I wasn't against the neighborhood. I was only against being treated like a doormat. Many neighbors thanked me for my role in exposing Cheryl's misuse of power. With her gone, the general mood was lighter. People felt safe to walk their dogs or set out their garbage bins without fear of a petty complaint letter. As for me, I beefed up the security in my garage office. A new digital keypad code, this time carefully updated and checked, twice, plus a motion detector that alerts me if anyone steps inside. I double-locked my carport as well, just in case. My succulents? Still there, thriving, and no one's harassing me about them. That alone felt like a small personal victory. Reflecting on the entire journey, I learned that boundaries, once crossed and left unchallenged, invite further trespass. Cheryl's brazen property borrowing escalated from a carport to an actual break-in twice, before I finally took an action that woke her up to the seriousness of her behavior. Some might say I overreacted, others feel I was justified. But I have no regrets. My home is my sanctuary, and no one has the right to violate that. This story, though extreme, highlights a broader issue that can arise in any neighborhood, especially those with active HOAs. There's a delicate balance between ensuring the neighborhood stays attractive and letting a power-hungry board member or neighbor run rampant. If you're dealing with someone who weaponizes rules, gather evidence. Photograph instances of trespassing, save complaint letters, store emails in a folder. You never know when you'll need to show a pattern of behavior. Roy's biggest asset wasn't intimidation, it was documentation. We often hear about neighbor disputes over fences, trees, or noise. Yet what happens when one neighbor systematically uses the HOA as a personal enforcement squad? If the board members or the rules are vague enough, it can lead to a tyranny of petty infractions. That's exactly what Cheryl attempted. She leveraged the system, writing official-sounding letters, passively threatening people with fines, and authoring new bylaws that suited her convenience. In the end, she sowed distrust throughout the community. Ask yourself, would you call Roy a hero or a vigilante? Did he cross the line by towing away Cheryl's SUV and making her believe it was sold for scrap? Or did he simply illustrate a point that repeated trespassing can have severe consequences? Sometimes neighbors with no boundaries only learn when you show them how it feels to lose something they consider theirs. HOAs themselves can be positive, ensuring everyone's property remains well kept and communal areas are maintained. But there's a dark side if someone like Cheryl uses those powers for personal gain. Clearly written rules, transparent leadership, and fair dispute resolution processes are crucial. In Roy's case, it took dramatic evidence and a wave of neighbor testimonies before the board. If Roy had chosen inaction, Cheryl might have continued dominating the community and invading his garage. Another aspect is the question of safety. Roy felt unsafe in his own workspace. Anytime he stepped out, he worried he might come back to find her vehicle parked by his desk. That sense of violation can be more stressful than a direct confrontation, because the conflict lingers like a dark cloud. He tried polite warnings. He tried changing the code. Cheryl ignored all of it. If you're dealing with a similarly toxic neighbor, it's crucial to know your local laws. Trespassing is illegal for a reason. If they become openly hostile, threatening you, or repeatedly ignoring your boundaries, documentation plus legal consultation is often the best route. Of course, Roy's chosen route was unconventional. He leveraged his friend's towing service, betting on the shock factor to get Cheryl to back off. Had she called the police, the outcome might have been complicated. But Roy had carefully gathered proof of her trespassing, plus a record of his attempts to communicate. It's a reminder that if you're going to take a bold step, you'd better have your receipts lined up. Roy did. People often ask, how does something like this escalate so far? The answer is simple. It starts small, maybe a snide complaint about a trash bin. Then it builds, complaint by complaint, confrontation by confrontation, until the final straw is something outrageous, like parking in someone else's private garage. By that point, one party has grown so brazen they feel unstoppable, and the other party, exhausted by fruitless negotiations, contemplates a more radical move. Roy's version of a radical move was faking a scrap sale, and in the end, it forced the HOA to see just how out of control Cheryl's behavior had become. Now you might be wondering, what if Roy had just calmly called the police the first time he found her car inside his office? Sure, that might have been the straightforward. But perhaps Roy felt the HOA would side with Cheryl or treat it as a minor neighborly dispute. After all, Cheryl was on the board, and she'd already managed to pass that emergency parking rule. Roy knew her influence in the community was strong. Instead, he orchestrated a scenario that made Cheryl experience genuine fear of losing her property, mirroring how he felt each time she strolled into his private space, ignoring his right to privacy. In some ways, that scrap metal revenge was symbolic. You disrespected my property, so here's what it's like when your property is taken away. While it may seem extreme, it aligned perfectly with the old adage that you have to speak someone's language for them to truly understand. Cheryl's language was ignoring boundaries. Roy spoke it back to her, in a way that left no room for further disregard. Once Cheryl realized she couldn't keep people under her thumb, she faded from the neighborhood scene. The emergency HOA meeting was her downfall, because it shined a bright light on her long list of transgressions, not just against Roy, but against numerous neighbors who had stayed silent to avoid her wrath. It's often the case that a bully operates freely until someone stands up, and then everyone else feels safe admitting they had issues too. By the end of that meeting, Cheryl lost her board seat in an emergency vote. The new board made changes to prevent one person from unilaterally pushing through ambiguous rules. They also clarified actual emergency protocols, so if the neighborhood genuinely floods or faces a severe storm, a proper system for shared resources can be put in place, but always with transparent communication. Not long after, the for sale sign went up on Cheryl's property. Whether it was shame, anger, or the realization she no longer had power over the community, she chose to leave. A few neighbors reported seeing potential buyers touring the place, but Cheryl was rarely present. Finally, moving loaded her belongings and took her away. She gave Roy one last fleeting glance as she left, but no words were exchanged. In that moment, Roy felt a mix of relief and sadness that it had to go this far. But he also felt justified. Sometimes standing up for yourself means walking a risky path. With Cheryl gone, the neighborhood vibe shifted. The HOA even organized a potluck, a chance to reconnect as neighbors and show that the community wasn't defined by pettiness or power struggles. Roy attended, bringing a dish to share, chatting with folks he hadn't really spoken to before. Many thanked him for revealing Cheryl's true nature and helping restore a sense of fairness and mutual respect. Some joked that they were glad they hadn't ended up on her bad side. Others admitted they'd been cautious around her for fear of retribution. Roy realized he'd probably saved a lot of people from future headaches by drawing a line in the sand. He also double-checked every security measure on his garage office. No more old codes floating around. He installed a motion detector that pings his phone if there's unusual movement. It might sound like overkill, but after having a neighbor twice break in and park right next to his desk, you can't blame him. The succulent garden remained unscathed by further complaints. The trash bin rules stayed reasonable, and Roy continued his coding in peace, free from the daily anxiety of spotting Cheryl lurking outside. The sense of violation he'd felt, someone waltzing into his private workspace, had cut deep, but ironically, it made him appreciate his home all the more once that threat was removed. His dream of a serene home office was restored, and if any new neighbor tries something similar, Roy now has a well-documented blueprint for how to handle it. Throughout this story, a few moral dilemmas emerge. 1. Is it ever okay to fight fire with fire? Roy tried polite conversation, direct warnings, and even email objections. None worked. So he escalated to a psychological tactic that might have crossed the line for some people's comfort. Yet for others, it was exactly the wake-up call Cheryl deserved. 2. Where should an HOA draw the line on enforcing minor rules versus respecting personal boundaries? We see the risk of a board member turning into a power-hungry enforcer. That's why accountability and clear policies matter so much. 3. How can a neighborhood avoid breeding resentment among its residents? Communication and mutual respect can go a long way, as opposed to one person's vigilante approach to rule enforcement. The bottom line is that if you're dealing with a Cheryl in your life, someone who disregards your property rights, threatens you with petty rules, or believes they're above boundaries, the best recourse is consistent documentation and, if necessary, a strong, well-planned response. Going nuclear shouldn't be the first step, but sometimes it becomes the last resort when nothing else works. Roy's story exemplifies. So, was Roy a hero for standing up to a tyrant or a vigilante who took matters too far? That's the question only you can answer. Personally, I see a homeowner who tried every polite channel first and only resorted to a dramatic measure when absolutely pushed to the edge. Cheryl's downfall, culminating in her departure from the neighborhood, might seem harsh, but so was her repeated invasion of Roy's garage, her manipulation of HOA rules, and her intimidation of others. This conflict makes you wonder, if not for Roy's bold action, how long would she have continued rampaging through the neighborhood? If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or had a run-in with an entitled neighbor, drop a comment below. Do you sympathize with Roy, or do you think he took it too far? And if you've ever had your own version of a Cheryl, share your story. These cautionary tales help us all see how important it is to protect our property and sanity. Smash like scrap metal revenge was justified. Comment HOA nightmare if you've ever been caught in a similar situation. This story isn't just about drama. It's about the real human need for respect, safety, and the importance of boundaries. Thank you for watching Talum, where real stories meet real consequences. Until next time, stay respectful out there, folks. Look out for one another, and remember that sometimes, even the quiet guy typing away on his computer can deliver the biggest surprise. You never know who's keeping receipts, monitoring security cams, and waiting for the perfect moment to stand up for what's right. That's the end of Roy's tale, but maybe it's the beginning of yours. If you ever find yourself on the receiving end of unwelcome intrusion, don't just seethe in silence. Gather evidence, reach out to the proper channels, and if you must, take decisive action. But always, always, know the risks and the laws in your area. Roy's final success was only possible because he had thoroughly documented Cheryl's trespassing and possessed concrete proof of her overreach. Without that, he might have been painted as the aggressor. We'll see you soon for another eye-opening story from our channel, where we spotlight the line between right and wrong, the battle between pushovers and bullies, and the dramatic lengths people will go to defend their piece of the world. Until then, set your boundaries, treat your neighbors with respect, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself when push comes to shove. After all, you never know when a seemingly small problem might escalate into a full-blown 808 showdown. Stay safe. And remember, sometimes revenge is less about hurting the other person and more about making sure they never forget your property is yours for a reason. If they won't respect that, you might just have to show them exactly how serious you are. What would you do if your neighbor parked in your private garage?